You can't just have this fun idea or crazy idea of using a food or using something that's never been used before and expecting that it's going to stay that way, even through a 6-week exhibition. So the more you work with materials that are not tried and true, you find these kinds of things happening all the time. It's really part and parcel of the unexpected shocking of yourself. Like, oh, that's not what I thought would happen. And now I have to cope with that. This kind of almost yoga-like meditative process of focusing on one thing at a time became so dramatically healing for me that I try to use it. The difficulty is recognizing that you're never really going to get there. I think you think there's somewhere that you're going when you're starting out, and that there will come a time when you won't have these problems, whatever those problems are. It's just recognizing that it's okay and just do the best you can.
Welcome to the Installation Art Podcast, the number one and only podcast about installation art and the people who work with it. In each episode, you will hear about the joys and challenges of the medium and get an exclusive behind-the-scenes look at the career and process of internationally renowned guests. I am your host, Anastasia Parmson. My guest today is the legendary American artist, Sandy Skoglund. She was a pioneer in stage photography, constructing incredibly elaborate and colorful installations like Radioactive Cats and Revenge of the Goldfish to be presented initially as photographs. Sandy's career spans decades, and her works have been acquired by many major collections worldwide, like Centre Pompidou, Reina Sofia, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is a huge honor and privilege to talk to a true icon of contemporary American art. I still can't believe I get to say this, but here's my today's guest, Sandy Skoglund. Thank you, Sandy, again for coming on the Installation Art Podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Anastasia. So I looked at your work. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you. That's a big honor coming from you.
Oh, I was really, really impressed by the conceptual aspect of it, the 2D, 3D.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really
Thanks.
thought that was unique. I've never seen anything quite like that. So I'm glad to meet you.
I'm very glad to meet you too, and thanks. It means a lot.
Sure, absolutely.
Actually, I discovered yesterday that you were also a guest on the Jealous Curators podcast, Art for Your Ear.
Yeah.
And she is actually one of my big inspirations to start a podcast in the first place.
Oh, fantastic. What a great coincidence.
Yeah. So that was a pretty great interview, and you went quite into depth about your background and growing up and how you got into making art in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So if people want an in-depth of that, they should go and listen to that episode. But as for us, maybe let's talk briefly about what it was like growing up for you and how did you come to discover art for yourself?
Well, the first thing I discovered is that I was alone because I was the only child for 2 years. So I think being alone with your parents like that, I'm actually one of 4 children, but those early years of consciousness, I think, are really critical to understanding yourself. And so I think that was a big piece of it. And I also think that I can't imagine how I would be if I hadn't had polio when I was 3 years old. So the polio, one of the many polio epidemics in 1949, I was born in 46, and 49 went through the northeast of the United States, and I got polio. My brother got it as well. He was only a year old. And for me, it's shadowed me my whole life. I mean, I have a slight paralysis in my left shoulder. affects your whole body with a kind of weakness. But there was another piece of experience there because we were quarantined, my brother and I, in the harbor of Boston. They had a ship that they put, I think it was all polio victims or children, I'm not sure what. But I don't remember that much, although there are a few key impressions that I do bring away with me from that period. I mean, for example, I remember somebody lying to me.
Mm-hmm.
And my idea of reality was shattered. What happened is I was sitting on the bed in the ward. So it was a room with lots and lots of beds in it. And I was creating a ruckus. I was calling for my mother, screaming, acting out. So a nurse came over and told me she would call my mother and ask her to come if I would be quiet. So I stopped acting out and I saw her go over to the phone. It was a public phone in the hallway and it was open. So I could see it was like a nook. So she goes into the booth and she calls. And so then I just sat on the bed waiting for my mother to come. And of course, my mother came, right? No, she did not. She didn't come because the nurse lied to me, to make me quiet down. But the slow realization over probably an hour or two of what had happened and that she had fooled me really impacted me in terms of my sense of reality, I guess.
Right.
How the world shows itself to you.
Yeah. And so was that also a time where you would do creative things and do stuff with your hands?
Yeah, all the time. I drew all the time from as far back as I can remember. I was always looking forward to art class. I loved telling stories to myself, actually. So I would tell myself stories based on the television programs of the time, which were the Howdy Doody show, was a very big cultural experience for my generation. And in that Howdy Doody show, there was Howdy Doody himself, but there was a Princess Summer, Fall, Winter, Spring, who was an American Indian puppet. And I would pretend that I was Princess Summer, Fall, Winter, Spring and create all these stories and draw on paper, or actually I remember drawing on anything that was around. So that was sort of as far back as I can remember, a combination, not just the imagery, but there's the storyline as well.
So then you went on to study art, painting to be more specific, and you dabbled with a bunch of things like performance, then taught yourself photography. What compelled you to then start making installation works and sculptures?
I think it goes back to my interest in the experience of the gallery. The gallery is, it's a container for people to experience contemporary art or art of all kinds. And I just felt as though I wanted to change that space, even from the beginning. So my graduate exhibition at the University of Iowa, which would have been in 1972, that show is really an installation.
Mm-hmm.
I was heavily influenced by George Siegel, the figurative sculptor, Edward Kienholz and Nancy Kienholz, who were also doing figurative sculptural tableaus. So I was coming at art at that point from the perspective of the space itself, the exhibition space itself, and trying to, I guess, draw the viewer in a different way, engage the viewer in a way that was more dynamic and more entertaining than pictures on a wall.
Mm-hmm. And how did your first installation come about? What space was it in and what did it look like?
Well, the first installation that I did that I showed as an installation was called Radioactive Cats. And that was in an alternative space in Hartford, Connecticut, Real Artways. So I had spent a year sculpting cats out of direct plaster. I wanted them to each seem different, but the same, as if in a photograph you see the different stages of a particular movement. So I was interested in animating the space through these figures, these characters, which were 25 or 24 different sculptures of cats. Originally, I was working with photography, actually, because prior to that, in 78 and 79, I was doing only photography and essentially catching up to the technique and technology of that particular time. And so I was learning how to do still life photography, commercial photography of like cosmetics, things like that. So the cat sculptures came into sort of their raison d'etre was really not to be an installation, but to be a photograph.
Mm-hmm.
But having now done the cats over a long period of time, loving the process and feeling as though I wasn't just making things in order to photograph them, that's when I decided to show or exhibit the installation or the ingredients or the materials that were part of taking the photograph.
And how did that first opportunity to show that larger work come about?
Just part of being in the New York and New England art milieu at that time, showing in alternative spaces is an easy, accessible, usually fairly accessible way to exhibit your work publicly when you don't have commercial galleries and museums yet that are interested in what you're doing. So that alternative space, Real Artways, was a good start for me. And I showed in a number of different spaces like that, alternative spaces.
You've used a lot of very unusual materials in your work. How do you decide what material to use for a particular project?
That's really the most fun part of the whole thing is what materials am I going to use and why too, because it's a combination of thinking and feeling and also objective translation, because you might say, for example, with the piece that I sent you an image of, Fresh Hybrid, which will be on view starting in September 2025. With that piece, the very first thought I had was soft. I wanted it to be about the softness that you feel when nature stops being frozen in the spring. And it's kind of like the world just becomes like cotton. It just becomes this a welcoming blanket, as opposed to with winter, it's a kind of a forbidding specter of possible pain and agony, I guess. So with that piece, Fresh Hybrid, I decided to work with fabrics and to work with felt. I learned how to make felt. There are different ways to make it. And I used needle felting and covered the mannequins with this felt. Also, I love kitsch. I don't know any artist who does not love kitsch. And I read up on it, but every time I try to read about it and understand the meaning of it or try to get more depth about it, it seems to make the enjoyment go away. But the kitsch element with Fresh Hybrid is the chicks, is these little Easter chicks that are sort of ubiquitous, at least in the United States, when Easter comes and spring and yet another sign of this kind of totally innocent entity, so to speak, that just springs out of nowhere, and it's delicate and vulnerable. So I went through all those thought processes and feeling processes, and decided to also base this piece around that. So in the trees, it's an outdoor piece. So it's trees that are dancing around in the spring, hybrid, they're animal trees, and they are covered also with wool, which I combed out and made to look like colored fur. So when I can, I really like to elaborate on a material, try to use it in as many ways as possible. And so fresh hybrid is really kind of, I guess, for me, an expression of freshness, of newness that's not intellectualized. It's raw and it's primal.
And what's the most weird or difficult material you've worked with so far?
Oh my God. Let's see. Probably, well, I could talk about the cocktail party with the Cheez Doodles.
Oh, yes. Let's.
With that piece, I did studies. I wanted to do a piece with snack foods because I like the idea with food of it's good for you and bad for you, and the kind of double entendre, particularly with artificiality, making food more attractive and in the process making it kind of deadly. So my studies of snack foods led me to Doritos, which are triangular corn chips. I would hot glue them on the wall of my studio and look at them. And I did buy Cheetos or Cheez Doodles. They're two different kinds. Cheez Doodles are made by Wise, the Wise company, and Frito-Lay makes Cheetos. And I liked Cheez Doodles better because they were a little bit smaller and they were a little more like a caterpillar, and they had more variety in their shapes. So I chose the Cheez Doodles. And what happened is I was invited yet another, the kinds of projects that we do where you're interacting with a nonprofit. In this case, it was an arts organization that had invited artists to do a space around a mini golf course. So I was just one of however many artists they had invited to do a mini golf course hole. You know, there would be a hole and then your piece would be an installation around that hole. And the exhibition was going to be literally a mini golf course inside in an art loft in downtown Manhattan. So that was the first time I worked with Cheez Doodles. So I glued Cheez Doodles onto a number of, I guess, sculptures that were it was like a sketch of an installation. So there was a rabbit, there was a flower, a big, huge flower, 10 times the size of what a flower should be. And I glued these Cheez Doodles onto it. And so the piece gets installed. I installed it. The show opens up, and then a week or two later, it's completely lost its color.
Mm.
And that's the contradiction with our expectations about artificiality and reality. So artificial does not mean permanent. The artificial color was very fugitive for the Cheetos. And so immediately I knew that if that piece were going to last through the show, I was going to have to do something, right? Otherwise it was going to be unspectacularly the color of light yellow corn. So I was in a panic. I took the pieces to my studio. I painted them the yellow orange that they are supposed to be, put them back in, and it kind of made it through that installation that way. But that showed me that I needed to work on these things, that you can't just have this fun idea or crazy idea of using a food or using something that's never been used before and expecting that it's going to stay that way even through a 6-week exhibition. So the more you work with materials that are not tried and true, like bronze, for example, oil paint, even oil paint has its drawbacks, but you find these kinds of things happening all the time. It's really part and parcel of the unexpected kind of shocking of yourself, like, oh, that's not what I thought would happen. And now I have to cope with that. So it does make the experience more humbling in a way, because you have to work really hard to kind of prop it up and make it be the way you want it to be. So with the cocktail party, originally it was just this mini golf course piece, but then I became like completely, what would be the word, mesmerized, completely succumbed to the essence of the cheese doodle itself. So in doing that, I then did the piece in my studio as a room. So I glued all of these cheese doodles, and with assistance, with help, with people, hot glue, individual cheese doodles all across the walls of my 1992, this would be, of my studio. And then I painted them with epoxy resin so that the epoxy resin would sink in and harden them so that when I painted them, they wouldn't soak up all the paint and collapse and lose their shape. So I did that. It took probably 3 months with lots and lots of help. And then I bought figures. I bought figures that go in store displays for winter, particularly for Christmas. They're animated. So you plug them in and the arm moves up and it moves down. So I bought some figures like that. And I bought some actual mannequins and resculpted the mannequins to look a little bit more realistic, and covered all of those with cheese doodles, again, coating them with epoxy resin, painting them with the yellow orange color, and took that as a sort of gargantuan photograph using very high-end techniques of studio photography with like tons of lights, with a big view camera, and so on and so forth. But having now done that, now the installation is embedded in my studio, the walls, because
exactly.
These doodles are on my wall.
Are they directly glued to the wall?
They were.
Wow.
In my frenzy, not thinking, just get it done. And so then what I did is I did the walls as panels and glued cheese doodles onto these panels so that I could then transport the installation into, at the time I was with an art gallery, Janet Borden, so I could transport the wall panels and the floor panels into her gallery for a temporary exhibition. Now, the good upshot of that whole enterprise from 92 is that the installation still exists. It's still there because, still alive, still dead, dead and alive, in the collection of a museum that I gave the installation to the museum because I was short of space for storage. And I was fortunate that they did accept it. And so partly due to their care and partly due to the use of the epoxy resin and the paint, it still looks pretty good. I saw it about a year ago, installed in that museum. But then there have been other pieces I've done where I've had to throw them out. I did what I thought was a beautiful piece of popcorn, using popcorn. And here's another thing, another reality versus expectation. So I thought, I'm going to use the most pure popcorn you could imagine. I bought only 100% organic popcorn with no preservatives in it, no nothing, just popcorn, beautiful white kernels, and did this really elaborate piece, making wall panels, floor panels. It was transported to be shown in several museums, but after about a year, it started to grow insects. And it was that's a really huge problem. I tried using sprays, insecticide and stuff, but nothing could really get rid of those insects. And I finally just had to throw it out. So when
Yeah.
my installations no longer exist, I'm so grateful that I have that photograph.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just really don't want my work to disappear. However, it can continue to exist, whether it's a photograph or a sculpture or an installation.
So do you always initially build that installation to be photographed? Is that your first goal?
Yes, I would have to say yes. I mean, yeah, that was the first goal back in 1980 with Radioactive Cats. And then prior to that, I did installations where I used found objects. Those were also for the camera. And I threw those installations out. So they were found objects that were arranged really for the camera, how they looked through the camera. And I wasn't really interested in saving all that stuff and then trying to hang it up as an installation. It was when I became more engaged with representational sculpture that it just became another level of care on my part. It was definitely not just for the camera. It was really a whole other kind of experience. I mean, the camera and the photograph are terrific. I don't mean to diminish the importance of that, but it's one single point of view on this elaborate experience in real space. And you can take more than one point of view, but it's still not quite the same. And then when you get engaged with materials, you kind of want people to really know what you're using, I think, if you can. And that's best done by actually having the materials in front of people.
Do you build everything yourself?
Not really. I try to work as much as I can by myself and use people when I need to. So I don't have an ongoing studio where there's someone, who's doing sculpture or doing photography or whatever. Even all the office stuff, I try to do it myself, partly because I really enjoy doing lots of different kinds of things. But I used a set design person for some pieces where I wanted some work upholstered in artificial grass. And he did that for me. He made an artificial fireplace and I painted that. So I I guess that's about, I mean, the sculpture I do myself, that for sure is all me. Although I can't physically handle a mannequin, for example. If I want to resculpt a mannequin, I'll cut the arms off and this and that and the next thing. But I'll need another person or two to help me hold it and move it around and what have you.
Mm-hmm. And in the early days, how would you go about finding someone to assist you or delegate the tasks?
Well, in the 80s, it was word of mouth, and being in the New York art world in the 80s and 90s. I only moved to Jersey City in 2002, 2003. Prior to that, I was in Manhattan. And I mean, there's just so many people there doing all kinds of stuff. So that was a time when it was word of mouth. There weren't so many ways to find people other than that. Even now, there's, I think, word of mouth and just exchanging ideas with other artists, other installation people or photographers. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk me through the choices you've made between using ready-made objects versus fabricating stuff.
Mm. Well, to me, it's about meaning. And the found object to me, I mean, I really am a big fan of art history. I got involved in fine art, through art history, through studying art history. If it hadn't been for being in college and studying art history and how from a civilization, it's one of the things that's left is the art objects. I mean, there are the words that are left behind, and then there are the objects left behind. So art history for me, especially modern art history, is really important in terms of why I decided to do what I do. So the found object, as we all know, is a really important part of modern art history, with Duchamp and the gesture of finding the urinal and calling it a work of art, and the whole idea of recontextualizing something that means something in the real world and moving it into the gallery. And now it has some other kind of meaning. So that, I take that for granted that everybody understands that. But how can I put this? The, the found object for me has a certain tongue in cheek aspect that I want to avoid in my life. For example, with the cats, when I decided that I needed to make cats in order to photograph them, because I couldn't have real cats roaming around and being able to control them, obviously. So I decided that I needed to have non-moving cats, right? Quite a few of them. Where do I get the cats? Just like you asked, and you have to solve this fairly soon. I mean, you can't be spending years just looking for cats. So I had a choice. I could have gone to not a prop store really, but there are stores that sell lawn objects, gnomes, things to put on your lawn. There are sculpted cats that you can buy that you can screw onto the outside of your house, and you have a cat crawling up your house. And I knew in my heart at that point in 1980 that gesture would, in a sense, be me saying that people who do that are lesser than, or they're of a culture that is, I don't know, not sophisticated. But I love those people. I love garden gnomes. I think the whole idea of it is fascinating. And so in order for me to get out of the frame of mind of me not being part of this vast society that we're part of, I needed to make my own cats. And by doing that, by investing myself, it was like, oh my God, so humbling, because the cats looked terrible. I mean, they didn't look like cats. The first cats were a total failure. And now suddenly, instead of me being involved with some highfalutin art history idea of, even radioactive cats, now it's like, here's this plaster. What is it going to take for this plaster thing to look more like a cat than some other animal? I mean, they were not identifiable. So this kind of almost yoga-like meditative process of focusing on one thing at a time became so dramatically healing for me that I try to use it, not all the time as a recipe, but it's a very humbling process to have to struggle with the material, to make it look the way you want to make it. And then to also say to yourself, well, it looks like a cat to me, but does it look like a cat to Anastasia? And so that brings me back into the real world, where I would ask friends who were not artists to just come and ask, what does that look like? I mean, does it look like a large rat or what? And so that kind of bringing me back into a recognizable sphere is very important to me in terms of, I'm doing art to communicate to my fellow human being of all spheres, of all walks of life. So it's important that they understand that they're looking at a cat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that kind of learning a skill or a material from scratch seems to be like your go-to. You've done bronze casting and you've done glass and you've done all these, even learning how to sculpt in 3D, like in virtual 3D.
I tried.
That seems so daunting to me, to just start from scratch and be like, right, so I'm going to learn this well enough to make an artwork from this.
Yeah, that was very painful. It was painful. And the only reason it was so painful, well, it was painful for two reasons. The most important part is there's no consensus in 3D sculpting. You know, Photoshop is the universal manipulator of photography, and then everything grows from that. In 3D digital work, making something to exist in 3D on the computer, there's no single program that everybody is using. So even trying to understand what program to use, I mean, the primary mover and shaker in 3D digital universe is movies, is animation. And then from that technology, you can take a small element of that and you can use those files to somehow make somewhat of a three-dimensional object. But it was very hard because it was like I had to teach myself without there being a teacher. And it was very slow too. It was way too slow. And the other downside of digital is that when you're working strictly digital, you're living in a seat, in a chair, and your eyes are on the screen like what, 8, 9 hours a day. And when I first started doing it, Anastasia, I thought, wow, this is great. I'm not going to have a storage problem. My studio is now like 10 by 10 feet. It's, you know, but then the months wore on, and it takes a certain kind of person. I mean, I have met in the course of doing all this work, have met people who they're very happy working that way. But for me, I really want to have a more fragmented and more disjointed, materialistic, as well as technological aspect to what I do. So my next goal after the show that I'm going to have in September 2025, my next goal is going to be standing and not all the time, but I mean, standing a lot. I want to draw at an easel. I want to get back into sculpting with clay, but clay, maybe plastilina. I love plastilina. Do you like plastilina?
I don't do
You don't.
any sculpture in the traditional sense of the word. I do more woodwork.
Oh, okay. Okay. Woodworking. So you cut and saw and you make all that furniture that I saw.
Not all of it. The first ones have been ready-mades that I've kind of upcycled. And now I want to move more and more into, fabricating my own and making something that's not really real furniture, but kind of looks like real furniture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you're definitely already 75% there because from what I saw on the web and on your website and just in general, I mean, is fascinating that I guess the trajectory of view of the viewer seems very critical to your thinking. And I think I share that with you. And yours is not a photographic trajectory, which is interesting. You know,
Yeah.
it's two eyeballs looking at it, you know.
Yeah, from different sides. Yeah, we do have some things in common, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you mentioned a word that I want to come back to, and that is storage.
Mm-hmm.
Because from what I hear, you decided quite early on that you not only want to photograph the installation and have the photo be the artwork, but you also were showing the installations as a freestanding work.
Right.
talk me through the storage. So you decided you're going to keep all the elements.
Mm-hmm.
Do you reuse certain elements for new projects?
Mm-hmm.
How does that work?
Well, to begin at the beginning would be there are the found elements and then there are the made elements. So I've always felt in the worst case scenario, the made elements have to be kept. Meaning if I've sculpted those cats, I'm going to make every effort to not have to get rid of them. So they do still exist and they're in a collection of a museum. But to me, that's not duplicable, right? Whereas in that installation, there is a radiator, there's a refrigerator, there's a table, some other stuff there. And that could be replaced. So even from the beginning, the whole idea of showing the installation started with me making the stuff. Prior to that installation of Radioactive Cats, I wasn't showing any installations except my graduate school thesis in 1972. And that installation is really a bunch of sculptures on the floor as chaise lounges and those kinds of furniture and some hanging things on the wall. So it's environmentally conscious. But after that, I pretty much did not do installations until I made Radioactive Cats. Now, after the cats, then I kept expanding and making more elaborate. I made like 120 odd ceramic fish for a piece called Revenge of the Goldfish. And there again, the fish I would really want to hold on to, and I could dispense with the furniture, although I actually still have it and the museum has it. Then there are the pieces that were made of food that just had to be thrown out. And so, for example, there's a piece I did with jam, with strawberry jam and marmalade, orange marmalade, and ceramic roses. I don't know how many ceramic roses I sculpted. And that was in 1994, called The Wedding. I was able to show it as an installation, but shortly after that, I threw out all the marmalade, the panels that had the dried marmalade on it, and the wall panels that had the strawberry jam. So trying to hold on to, from my point of view, the work that was very self-destructive, like was attracting insects. I mean, there was a period of time in my studio in New York where at the end of the day, every day, we would set mouse traps all over the floor because you can't get rid of mice in Manhattan. There are more mice than people in Manhattan. And so when you start fooling around with those materials, here they come. So I have thrown out lots of work, as actually have a lot of my sculptor friends. Sculpture is a huge responsibility and a bit of a burden if you want to look at it from that point of view. So I keep what I can and I throw out what I can, I guess. But right now, for example, I have a small garage building. It's about 25 by, I think 85 feet long. And most of it is full of molds for the things that I've made, these big plaster molds and stuff. And then in there is also the installation for the piece I digitally did called Winter. So that entire piece is in there, all in boxes and stuff. And then Fresh Hybrid, which is everything made of pipe cleaners, as well as the chicks and as well as the wool felt, that's in there as well, taking up a good 400 or 500 square feet. And for me, what I try to do is, if I can, donate the installation, if museums or spaces are willing to take it. I've been fortunate that some have done that. But other than that, you can't let all your old work drag you down. you have to move forward. So
I think it's an interesting point, the one about donating your work to an institution if you can. How would you approach an institution to even have that conversation? Did you know someone there? Had you already exhibited there, or how did that work?
yes, depending on which piece or what situation, almost in all cases, I showed the work there and then maybe toured it around to some other places and then came back and asked them or asked several places. Sometimes I was under time constraints. And so I would ask several places, and then the first one that would agree, I would go with it. And then you get to know curators when you have shows. And so they kind of follow you, and you then can ask that person as well. So it's a combination of the experience of showing it and knowing people.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're not so, what's the word? They're not so eager to have a lot of material either. So it's, from their point of view, also a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
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 It's not, a painting, think about a painting takes up how much space, and an installation is really, occupies a lot of space.
Your work often looks or is quite fragile. Did anything ever get damaged in the course of exhibition by the audience being too eager or something like that?
Yes, I remember showing in Manhattan the piece called The Wedding, and it had panels on the floor made of plexiglass, and on the plexiglass, I spatulaed orange marmalade. So that was on the floor, and then there were some mannequins in there getting married. And then on the wall were the strawberry jam panels, and they were clear plastic plexiglass pieces, rectangular modules. And on those rectangular pieces of plastic, I spatulaed strawberry jam and then let it dry and congeal. Takes place over about a week. And then you can put it upright, vertical, and it won't fall off. So the piece was installed in my gallery, one of the galleries I was working with. This would be 1994. And I remember someone stumbled into and fell into the marmalade.
Oh no.
But, these things happen. I mean, that's part and parcel of the real world, right?
Yeah.
I had a wonderful talk with an old friend the other day about when we were young artists in New York in the 80s. And she told me this hilarious story of, she had this huge round sculpture, literally like 6 feet around or something like that. And she was, young and inexperienced and everything. She goes to bring it into the gallery and it gets stuck in the doorway, and they couldn't get it in or out.
Oh no.
And they had to go find a special saw. And this would be New York, Manhattan. So at that time, there were artists everywhere. So she goes, or I guess her husband or somebody goes and gets a saw from someplace around the corner. And then they are sawing away because I mean, what are you going to do? You can't get it in or out. But yeah, that's a great story, I think.
What a lesson to learn the hard way.
Right. Don't make it too small or too big, right? Just right. Make it just right.
Measure the entrances before you start sculpting.
Right. I mean, another piece of advice would be, if you're going to really be married to installation, make it from the beginning so that it collapses down. Have that part of your thought process so that it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube, and it just all becomes one thing, and then you kind of unpack it for when you install it.
But when your work is now getting installed, let's say someone wants to show what's in their permanent collection, do you still have to be personally present to install it?
No. I don't have any installations in any private collections, sculptures and photographs and drawings, but not a real installation. And in every case, when I've given away or sold or whatever, don't have an installation anymore, it's pretty heavily documented. And it's very possible for them to do it without me. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Really. I think that's very important. If you want your work to be shown and you're not there, right? I mean, you might be dead and you would want people to see your work, right? So a booklet or a book of how to do it, what goes first, second, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
How long does it take you on average to complete one of those installation works?
Well, there isn't, I guess if you average it, a year, but when it's way too long, it's many years. Things take longer when I do that handmade sculpture part because I'm doing that handmade sculpture part. If it's all found objects and you can delegate, you can make it happen faster. So I can't imagine doing something for less than 6 months, probably a year average. And then sometimes, many, many years, because what can happen with me is I'll get off going on one tangent and then other ideas will come in and I'll go, oh, it would be so much better if I do this as well. So then that's a whole other year an example would be, the piece Walking on Eggshells. And it started very simply. I knew that I wanted to illustrate the idea of walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
So walking on eggshells, I was going to just literally do that. So I knew that I was going to show it as an installation. So I knew I couldn't have real eggs because how long would that be able to be shown without smelling and God knows what? So the first year of working on that installation was just in figuring out how to empty out the eggshells and clean them out and make them somewhat sterile. Once I figured that out with an assistant, then I used one assistant to do that work on her own time. I paid her, of course, and she would then bring back the eggs that were cleaned out, and we would have a whole round robin thing there with the eggs. But at the same time that was going on, I decided that I wanted to talk about the history of eggs in a way, which is kind of interesting because they're almost always used to symbolize new life. And, we don't have eggs. We have eggs, but we don't get born inside an egg. So the more I started thinking about eggs, the more I decided to go back to art history and look at how art history had depicted eggs and snakes and rabbits in terms of Easter and new life and all of that. So that piece ended up taking about 3 years, and I did wall tiles that are all cast in paper. And on the wall tiles are images from art history, starting with the pharaohs and the Egyptians and coming up to the contemporary American Easter Bunny, and how incongruous it is that we often show the Easter Bunny holding an egg. And, rabbits don't have anything to do with eggs, but symbolically they kind of come together. So just those kinds of cultural gestures really fascinate me.
And those wall tiles you made the drawings all one by one?
I did the drawings not one by one. I did them myself, deliberately tracing art history images so that they would have the flavor of a hieroglyphic, or they would have the flavor of, let's say, a Renaissance painting where there's a figure stepping on a snake. And so I did drawings that were line drawings. And then from the line drawings, I made rubber molds, which were then used to cast the tiles. So there are 45 different images, and they start with 3000 BCE and come all the way up to the present, going through various cultures and eggs represented in various ways in different cultures in combination with snakes and rabbits.
Yeah. Then you also made all the objects in that, because it's a bathroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
You also fabricated everything in the bathroom.
Well, they're cast from actual bathroom fixtures.
Ah,
that's
fascinating.
Yeah, that's how they were made. So, for example, I bought a bathroom sink, had a mold made. I didn't make the mold myself. And then I used an expert in paper casting and worked with him and with a paper making company in Manhattan called Dieudonné. And together, all of us kind of collaborated to do that part of that piece. So the bathtub, for example, was a real bathtub with a big, humongous mold. Same thing with the toilet. And then the floor is covered with, I never counted the eggshells, but I can only imagine hundreds of thousands, I guess,
Jeez.
A lot.
And then
beautiful.
When it was the moment of taking the photo of that work and the models stepped in, and then it was a very fleeting moment where they would crush the eggshells.
Exactly. You really get it. Oh my God. I can't believe it.
Well, I mean, I can't believe it's real eggshells.
Yeah, no, I mean, my favorite part of that whole piece is the colors of the eggs. They're darker and lighter, and from what I understand, it's based on what the chickens eat.
The type of chicken as well, I think.
Kind of chicken, exactly.
Yeah, but that color variation is what makes them look like real eggs. That's how you know they're real eggs.
I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So, because it takes so long to make each project, tell me, how do these large projects get funded?
Usually it's just bit by bit, because I don't know the whole thing at all when I start. It's a kind of an adventure and a journey, and I have to know something. Like, I know that I like cats. So that motivates me to sculpt one cat. And then it's the dissatisfaction with the one cat that makes me sculpt the next one. And it's the dissatisfaction that keeps pushing me forward with something like that when I'm sculpting. When I'm not doing that, when I'm not doing the sculpting, the financial part is I don't know even how to explain it. I mean, I don't look for funding per se. Well, I mean, if we go back to the beginning, I paid everything for the Radioactive Cats. I used materials that I could afford. So plaster for the cats, found stuff on the street, the furniture. With Revenge of the Goldfish, clay is very affordable. And everything in there I paid for myself, trying to think. And
so you were teaching at the time?
Teaching.
Yeah.
Teaching had definitely been a very important part of what has allowed me the time and the money too, to do this kind of work. It's a combination of, I think for all of us, you need time and you need money. And, what is the best combination for you when you're working? If you're working alone, for example, and people cost a lot of money, assistants cost money, although you can use interns or people who volunteer. That's another way of working. I have friends who do that as well. I'm not partial to that. I prefer to pay people. But I remember working on Revenge of the Goldfish, which was really a lot of labor. Every day going to the ceramic studio to make fish out of clay and try to make each one come alive and be different and have a feeling about it and be fully invested. And I remember thinking at the time, I wish I had the money to hire somebody to help me. But I think in the end, life pointed me in the right direction. It's better that that didn't happen and that I had to struggle and do the best that I could. And I guess that's really what I define for me as ultimately meaningful in terms of why am I doing this? What is it about? What keeps me going? And in a sense, it's really each piece, each episode is really creating a meaningful struggle, a struggle. That's where the learning part is kind of like, well, who the heck do you think you are that you could possibly know how to do this kind of thing? You know, overcoming my inability to do something has a kind of journey, an internal journey that solves itself, regardless of money, regardless of external success. It's rewarding in itself.
Mm.
So that was important to me. I think it's important to be able to separate yourself from the external part of what happens. And that was the thing that has worked for me. So yes, deliberately creating learning experiences are a very simple way to do that. In a way, there's nothing for me quite so exhilarating as not knowing how to do something. Once you know how to do something, well, what then? So it's probably my failing, you know, is I stop once I know how to do it. But I'm just talking off the top of my head now. And I've gotten away from your question about the money part. I mean, there are times when people have offered me a show, a museum has offered me a show, and then they will pay a fee. And that does not anywhere near cover the cost, but it helps and it's a motivator. So there's that, either an installation fee ahead of time to create the work for them being the venue in the beginning. Then once you've created it and you travel your work as an installation, it's fairly common to have an installation fee be part of the agreement when you show an installation. And I think it's more common than, say, if you were showing paintings.
Yeah.
I don't think it's part of the language of exhibiting a painting. Although I could see where that could be an issue, like the frames. The frames cost a lot of money. That's a big problem with photography. What else? What other ways? Workshops are a good way to, within the context of your show, of your exhibition, it's I think, a nice way to have the public interact with the work and have a workshop where you're there with some of the public and you do something together. You can have a fee for doing a workshop.
Yeah. How do you approach that commercial aspect of your work and the process of selling the work beyond the photography? Do you even try to sell installations? Do you break it up into pieces? How does that work for you?
It doesn't matter very much. It's sort of each thing has its own kind of reality. So I don't know how to answer that. There have been many times when installations have been broken up for different reasons. Sometimes they're really huge. And let's say if someone wants to show it in Europe and they don't want to transport the whole piece. I did this with the greenhouse, for example. The greenhouse no longer exists as an intact installation. It's made of many, many sculptures of dogs that I sculpted, and it has artificial grass throughout. That's the piece where the prop maker upholstered furniture. But I broke it into two pieces in the beginning to enable it to go to Switzerland. And so it was shown in a gallery there as a fragment, meaning some of the dogs, some of the furniture, and so on. And then I kept a lot of it back here. And then little by little, it just kind of dissipated. The sculptures went out one by one or got sold individually, and it's just whatever I feel like doing, to be honest. I mean, it's nice to keep them together, but then they don't really get shown very often. Even if they're still intact, it's not very often that a museum is going to take it out of storage and show the whole thing. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then I love sculpture and I feel like I'm doing sculpture. So I'm very happy to cast sculptures from the installation and to sell them individually. Also, during COVID, I went through my work because I was quarantined, like we all were, in my studio. And I just felt like looking back at 20 years of work. So I found sculptures and I had them scanned and then miniaturized. So they're very tiny little dogs, and I call them mini sculptures in a limited edition. You know, it's just pieces of yourself, right? I mean, the installation is a part of you, and then they're just pieces of you. And I just think it's the more the merrier, really, in terms of how you can make it work for yourself.
What has been a particularly rewarding or transformative experience for you as an artist?
Oh, that's a very hard question.
Well, like a highlight of your career so far.
A highlight. I mean, there are the internal breakthroughs. That's where I look at highlights. I think from the outside, people think of highlights as, oh, my first show here, or, you know, that kind of thing. But I don't really I didn't experience things that way. I certainly had good luck in the 80s with exhibiting the installations and the photographs within the context of what was on people's minds, young artists' minds in the 80s. And so I was part of that zeitgeist. But I really think of the breakthroughs internally that I had all by myself working as the high points, to be honest with you. I mean, one high point I'll never forget was struggling sculpting the cats. So I sculpted one cat. It did not look good. Okay, go back the next day, another cat, the third cat, the fourth cat. And I'm really still thinking that I'm taking a picture. It's going to be a photograph. It's going to be at night. So it'll be dark gray. Everything will be dark. And it's one cat walking through the room. And so I'm looking to make one really good cat. So now it's the fourth cat and then the fifth cat. And what happens to the tail? The tail go up, down. The legs do this, legs do that. What's the cat thinking about? You know, what is the mentality of the cat? And I remember one day looking down at all of the failed cats on the floor and thinking, oh my God, they really look so much better together. And that was it. It was like, I'm now going to make a lot of cats. So that was one of my really transformative moments, I think.
And what is a difficult lesson you've had to learn in your career as an artist?
Difficult. Well, I guess, trying to figure out how to say this in a communicative way. The difficulty is recognizing that you're never really going to get there. I think you think there's somewhere that you're going when you're starting out, and that there will come a time when you won't have these problems, whatever those problems are.
Right. Yeah.
The money, your weakness, my physical weakness, or even health. You know, I mean, I went through a period where I had a lot of back pain or a space. The first 20 years of my life, all the artists around me had a big loft because that was the way it was. That's what you did. If you were an artist, you had a loft. And
Mhm.
I was always working in apartments because I couldn't afford the lofts. And I did not have the skills to go into a raw loft and change it so I could live in there. Cause that's a lot of money and time to just put in a bare bathroom. So in a way, I was like 10 years too late for the whole loft scene in New York. The real loft scene started in the 70s. So I just kept thinking, one day I'll have a loft. Meanwhile, I do Radioactive Cats, and meanwhile, I take a class in hand building clay in the basement of a ceramic studio in Soho. And then I move all the ceramic fish into an apartment and take the photograph in the apartment. Then I rent an apartment to work in the apartment. And then I actually buy 2 different apartments because they're so much easier to buy than to buy commercial property, because commercial property, you can't get a mortgage very easily. You can buy an apartment and use it as a studio much more easily. And so the whole trajectory of my life, I kept working in these non-lofts, thinking, well, I'm not quite there yet. So yeah, it's just kind of recognizing that it's okay and just do the best you can. And you're not really going anywhere.
But have you ever
Okay.
had moments where you think, this is it, I've made it?
No, not really. No, definitely not. Definitely not. No. You could say that there's satisfaction in recognition. There is satisfaction, and especially recognition if people are teaching your work or including it
Mhm.
in lesson plans and things like that. That's very moving and very, very wonderful spiritually. The idea of making it is, I think, liberating yourself to all the cares and woes that you and I are talking about. The money is no longer a problem. You can just do anything you want. That's never been the case for me. I am still teaching full time today, although I'm retiring in January. But no, I think that I don't know. I don't know what it would be like to be, I guess, liberated from those worries. It might not be so good. It might not be so great.
You
I,
might have other worries,
yeah,
like you
I think
said.
so. I think so. Money is a burden too. A lot of money, So I don't know. I feel kind of wedded to the idea that the money I have is really guilt free. I really made it myself, the money, and I'm doing what I want to do with it. And that's it. So.
That's great. I feel like that story about the loft and that you're 10 years too late to the loft scene, that is like a universal thing, as in today in Sydney, the artists are looking at prices of real estate and the cost of renting a studio, thinking, I'm 10 years too late to having a studio because now it's not affordable. And then the previous generation had some other problems and so on and so on. I feel like everyone's got that.
Right. It's true. It's true. You really have to. I mean, one of the things that really attracted me about being an artist was making everything up from scratch. Like, what do you do in the morning when you wake up? Where do you go? What does it look like where you're going? And so reinventing the space, reinventing like you're doing, through transforming the space and through the woodworking, all of those things I think are really what all artists should be doing, right? But I know what you mean. You see the previous generation and you think, well, they had it good or they could do that. And now I'm kind of stuck. But it's really, I don't know. I think myself working in the domestic places that I worked in really helped the work, actually. help the
Yeah.
content of the work in terms of feminism and domestic spaces versus industrial spaces in terms of what's an appropriate place to make art, right? I mean, what is it supposed to look like?
Yeah. But I think also like an apartment is a more manageable scale to work in to make an immersive installation
Yeah.
rather than be working in a loft where you'd have to build your own walls and ceilings and everything.
Absolutely. It is. It really is. I mean, the loft has a certain grandeur of its own, usually high ceilings or higher than domestic. And yeah, I mean, there are really a lot of drawbacks to the lofts. But I know that when I got my graduate degree from the University of Iowa out in the Midwest, Iowa City, I put all my artwork into a car with my friend, Ted. Ted and I were both colleagues and got our MFA degrees. And we drove from Iowa over to New York City to Soho, New York in 72. And where did we camp out? Where did we start? A loft, because that was what we thought you did.
That was the ultimate goal.
That was the ultimate goal. Now we're making art.
Can't make art without a loft.
Right. Exactly. But I know, I mean, I can't imagine what the situation must be like in Sydney. One thing about Australia is that it is the wide open spaces, isn't it? I mean, there is a sense of space, kind of like Texas in America. Right?
Well, yes, but also in the city, there is no space. That's the thing. And so, yeah, there are studio spaces, but a lot of people can't really afford them, even if they're working.
Oh, God. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah. A lot of artists are moving out of the city. I think it's the same in New York.
Yeah, it is. Well, in New York, I lived in Manhattan around the Soho area, Little Italy and stuff, lived there and worked there for 30 years. And the reason it worked is because it was somewhat abandoned. I mean, it was kind of derelict. Now it's movie stars. And so there are a few artists left there of my age, but they're kind of isolated amongst movie stars. And you can't really make your place, you could make your place dirty, I guess, but you can't bring a bag of plaster up too easily in a high-end elevator.
Yeah.
With a doorman. It's, those kinds of things. It's kind of interesting what's going on. There is a decentralization, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a dream project that you haven't been able to realize yet?
Just new work. I would really love to start new work because I do have a lot of ideas still percolating that are not done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what are you working on at the moment?
The show that I told you about in September of 2025, I'll have a solo museum show in Texas, in San Antonio at the McNay Art Museum. And it's a big space. It's about 7,000 or 8,000 square feet. And it'll be 3 installations. So this is a going back for me, really. All of the work has been created. We're going to borrow Revenge of the Goldfish from 1981 from the museum that has that piece. So I'm collaborating with that museum right now on how are we going to hang the fish, because the technology has all changed and the museum staff doesn't feel comfortable with what is on the fish now. And also they're too short. The wires, whatever is on them is too short. This museum has like 15 feet ceilings. So all the hanging fish, which is about 50 of them, that all has to be redone. So I've been researching that, sending up to the museum what I'm thinking might work, and they're working on that kind of thing. What else are we working on? Even how would we repair the fish if one gets broken? How would we do that? So all of that kind of going back, repairing, fixing, tuning up on 3 installations that'll be in that show. Fresh Hybrid, Radioactive Cats, and Revenge of the Goldfish. And it opens on September 11th in 2025.
On your birthday.
Yes. You remembered?
It's easy to remember.
My dad was born on September 11th, too.
Wow.
I know. No.
Oh, well, where can people buy your work? Where can they find out more about your work? Maybe follow you? Tell me.
Well, I think the best thing is the web nowadays, right? Just Google the name, what comes up. I have a website that has a lot of material on it. I also am working on a small website that is going to be more like my Instagram. It'll be more streamlined. It'll be more current work and what I'm thinking about. It'll treat more the show at the McNay, but that's kind of painful. I mean, I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah. I avoid updating my website like the plague.
Oh my God. That's been going on for way too long. I'm hoping to finish it in 3 months, maybe, if I'm lucky. So anyway, Google my name. Stuff will come up. I'm sure you'll see galleries there. I'm working with a wonderful gallery called Rule Gallery, which is based in Denver and also in Marfa, Texas. So we will do a tiny, eensy, weensy, itty bitty show. And I mean that literally. I mean, they have a little house in Marfa, Texas, which is where they filmed Giant. It's a kind of a abandoned town, but not abandoned. So the Chinati Foundation, the minimal artist, Donald Judd, they all retired there kind of. So there's some of that element there. But anyway, they have a small house there, little tiny house, and that's where their gallery is. So I'll be showing there and during the same time as the show.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that's it. Just let's all just keep on going, right? Let's keep on going.
Keep making the work.
Keep making the work. Yeah, exactly. I said to my colleague, a friend of mine who's been at Rutgers University where I've been teaching, she's been there almost as long as I have. And she said, I've been waiting to retire until you retire. I thought I was going to retire before you. I said, well, Sally, artists never retire. I'm just Rutgers. I'm not going to stop working. So yeah, I'm hoping it will give me a day off out of the week is what I'm hoping, because after all, we really don't we love to work? I mean, that is the one big thing that we all really do enjoy is working, right?
Yeah, you kind of have to, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Sandy. It's been great learning from you.
Well, thank you. It's been nice talking.
Wow, that was Sandy Skoglund, based in Jersey City. You can find out more about her work on her website, sandyskoglund.com. That's SandySkoglund.com. And go follow her on Instagram at Sandy Skoglund Art. You can see her work in person at the McNay Gallery in San Antonio, Texas. Her exhibition opens from September 11th, 2025. Sandy also works with Rule Gallery in Denver and Marfa. Links to those, as well as everyone mentioned in this episode, are in the show notes and on our website, installationartpodcast.com. And head on to our YouTube channel to see this episode with images of the work. Did you enjoy this episode? Share it with a friend or a fellow art lover. Word of mouth is one of the best ways to help us grow, and I appreciate your support. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.